we were really excited because we went on this trip to Turkey and Greece, and as part of it, we were talking about what would be beneficial to bring back and share with all of you, like what we learned, what we saw, and there's a lot. We were gone 11 days total.
Yeah, 12 with travel.
12 with travel. And we saw a lot of things. So we practiced today, and we're going to go faster tonight than we did today because it took us a long time to get through it. But I wanted to start out with a map of Asia Minor in the 1st century. So hopefully you can read it from where you are. But most of these cities, these are a lot of the places that we went. The 7 churches mentioned in the book of Revelation, we went to 6 of those. And then also in Greece, we went to Patmos, which is an island pretty much right smack dab in the middle, and we went to Athens, Greece. So you kind of have a visual of where those places are, and Corinth also. So that also pay special attention to the location of Corinth. It's right on the left over there above the word Achaia. It's in a tiny little strip of land between 2 oceans, and that will factor in to the explanation of Corinth. So it helps to get a visual just of where those places are to start. So I'm going to start with some Turkey facts. The first is that, and this was really surprising to me, I did not know this before we went, but approximately 60% of the places named in the Bible are located in modern day Turkey. In the Bible, it refers to it as Asia Minor. So if you can think in the New Testament, anytime you hear Asia Minor, they're talking about Turkey. And it's 60% of the places that are mentioned are in Asia Minor. After Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians in 586 BC, many Jews dispersed outside of Israel. So the Babylonians came into Israel, and everyone, the Jews, kind of scattered to various places. One of the main places they went to was Asia Minor. And Asia Minor became the home of many of these displaced Jewish communities, which is part of the reason Paul went there, because they were a ripe mission field. Okay, your turn.
Okay, so the Hellenistic kingdom settled 2,000 Jewish families in Asia Minor in 240 BC. So what that means is the Romans came in and they wanted to displace people to get rid of their culture, and the Jews really held on to their culture. So as part of this, what they would do is this Hellenistic kingdom, they would spread them out. And so a lot of them, 2,000 of them, were moved from Israel and moved up there. Both male and female turkeys gobble.
Turkey facts.
Within 2 decades of Jesus' resurrection, the gospel spread to Antioch, a city in Asia Minor, where believers were first called Christians. So it wasn't on the first map, but it's way down on the border of Syria and Turkey. And so before all of this, that was the first. We didn't go there because it would have been a very far drive, but that's when Christianity started spreading into Turkey and what was called Asia Minor then. And that's where they were called Christians for the first time, which was derogatory, but it just stuck.
In the 1st century, Turkey became the center for the growing Christian movement, and a lot of that is because there were already Jewish settlements in that place, which made sense for Paul to go visit and to bring the gospel message as the finish or completion of the Jewish story. Paul, Peter, and John are all linked with churches in Asia Minor. They all visited those places, started those churches, and kept a relationship with them. Wild turkeys sleep in trees. And 27 New Testament books were either written to or from Asia Minor. So 27 of the books of the New Testament out of 33, so that's a lot, were either written to or from places in Asia Minor.
So the main thing that I gleaned from, you're not supposed to read ahead. You guys are a bad class. Is in order to understand the New Testament completely, it's important to understand the context, and this really hit home to me. But just being there where Rome was, and all these cities were very, very Roman, and Christianity was so tiny. And then the geography and all that really just brought scripture that I've been learning my whole life, really brought it to life. And lastly, their poop determines if they're male or female. If you would like more information, go get that on your own. I have no idea what that means. I just saw that and thought it was interesting.
Vital information. So this was a trip that we took with my graduating class from Northern Seminary. I did a Master of Divinity at Northern Seminary with a New Testament emphasis, which meant I did a lot of classes in New Testament context. And like Jeff was saying, one of the things I learned is that in order to understand the New Testament as a pastor, you really need to know a lot about first century Roman Empire, first century Judaism, and the geography of the locations mentioned. There's something very different about standing in those places and understanding the landscape that helps you in your interpretation of Scripture. So the first place that we went was a place called Smyrna. It means, the word Smyrna in the ancient Turkish language means myrrh, which is a spice that they traded in. And Smyrna is the ancient name for a city that has now been swallowed up in modern day Izmir. Izmir is a huge city in Turkey, but we drove to a little, it's almost like a little neighborhood within the large city that has these ancient ruins, and that's Smyrna. And the place that we went, we saw a two-storied agora. And an agora is a gathering place for the community where there are shops, but it also has a community function where it serves state functions. So you can both do your shopping, but this is also where community leaders would meet and make decisions about their purpose as a community. So what made the Smyrna Agora so fascinating was that it was two stories. It had a basement level, there was running water, so we learned the Romans were very civilized. They cared deeply about hygiene. So they actually found ways to move water into cities, and this is part of what gave them such a large empire. But even in this agora, there was running water at the basement level, and then they had these arches over their hallways. So structurally, I mean, these things are still standing. So it's pretty amazing to see just the level of civilization the Roman Empire introduced.
Turkey dogs here. So this first is a good view of the side of the agora there. You saw the basement before, and this is the side. And this was the first introduction we had to these like community pets that they had around. It was at first, from being from America, it was really odd to see stray animals. It didn't seem good, right, to have them around. But pretty quickly you realize that they would, like you can see a dog just wandering over there. I think this might be the same puppy. They would just follow you around. And if you didn't really like a dog, they didn't care. They would just move to the next person, and if people would pet them, they would like it, and they would be fed by the community and by tourists. And you never, like, they were stray dogs, but they were always really well fed. They always looked really good. And they would actually, they would catch them, tranquilize them, and give them their shots and spay and neuter them, so they were very well taken care of. It was interesting because in Turkey, because it's very Islamic, they don't have pets inside. They don't keep animals inside their houses. It just isn't something you do. But then they realized they kind of liked pets. So they just turned into like community pets. So this was all around everywhere, dogs and cats everywhere, and they would just feed them, and they were, so in the beginning I kind of didn't like it. It was, what's going on? You got strays everywhere, and then after a while I was like, they kind of have a good thing going. They don't have to have fur in their houses, and everyone takes care of them.
We had two professors on our trip, and one of them loves cats, and she had been on this trip before. So she literally packed cat food, like dry food, in little baggies, and so everywhere we went, Becky was walking around feeding cats. So she was making lots of cat friends, but there were dogs everywhere too, and like Jeff said, the shops would have bowls of water and bowls of food sitting out by the street, and it's basically like a neighborhood dog or a neighborhood cat, and they just kind of stayed to their own little radius, and everybody knew them, and it was kind of an interesting arrangement. Okay. Pergamum also similarly was still in the large city of Izmir. Pergamum is an ancient city, also mentioned, it's one of the 7 churches in Revelation. And when we visited it, one of the things that was distinctive about it is we had to take a cable car from the road level to get up to the Acropolis where the ruins were. Pergamum had it was a huge, wealthy city in the ancient world. The Acropolis is where the elite lived. And it's hard to picture, but it's up on this hillside, and that's where all the fancy people lived. And they had the temples up there, they had their library up there, they had the theater, like all the nice civic functions were on top of the hill. All the people with lower status lived at the base of the hill and had to climb the hill to take care of the elite people, but the elite people very rarely came down. So just to it was helpful to have that visual to see how it was arranged, but we had the benefit of not hiking up the hill. We got to take a cable car, which I was frankly very thankful for. Okay.
So this gives you some perspective. This was another agora here in the center, like Laura talked about, where it would be kind of a city center, and all the city functions would happen in a square. You can see there's remnants of pillars there. They put those back up just so you can see how big that was. At the top of the theater here, and you can see kind of a wall that remains on the top over there, was another temple. So this is the steepest theater that's known, I believe, in Asia Minor. We went on it. They recommended that people don't climb down it, so obviously the people beeline right for it, right? Our whole group. If you want to see a really cool video, we didn't put on here for time, but I have one on my phone, and just sitting there like a spectator, and just the way that this theater caught the noise. Way down in the city, there was a street, and it was just peaceful and quiet, and you could hear the car. It was probably 5 miles away, and you could hear the car driving. That's how well this theater caught the noise. And the people would be, you can see tiny people down at the bottom. Do you see? Those are people there. So that's how huge this theater is. About 10,000 people could fit in the theater. Pergamum also had the second largest library, estimated about 200,000 volumes. And they invented parchment there, which was pretty interesting. I think someone else took over the,
yes.
What was the previous?
So this is pretty funny. So Alexandria in Egypt had the largest library. You may have heard something about this in history classes along the way. Alexandria in Egypt had a huge library, and Egyptians had papyrus, which is a paper made out of reeds, basically. And so they were in competition, these two libraries. The Pergamum library was in competition with the Alexandrian library, and the king of Pergamum commissioned all of the people to invent a new form of paper, because the Egyptians stopped shipping them papyrus because they didn't want them to have as many books. So they invented parchment in Pergamum. That's one of the things it's known for.
That's what you do when you're Rome. You just tell people to invent something, and you make a deal. And they do it.
It's great.
So this was fascinating here. So in Revelation, John talks about the altar of Zeus, or actually he talks about Satan's seat. He references that in Pergamum, and we're not sure. It could be just a euphemism. It just could be symbolic, a metaphor for them and their debauchery, everything that was going on there, and calling it Satan's seat. But also, they had this huge Zeus's temple that was there in Pergamum, right next to that agora. Okay, so fascinating story. When we saw this throughout, that Turkey didn't really care about their ruins that much. Like, there wasn't very it wasn't very excavated and everything. So in the 20s, the Germans came in, and this was part of this bigger city, and they were hired to put a road through modern day Izmir, it's called, So they're going to put a road through there, and they needed stone. So they asked the locals, hey, where's a quarry around here that we can get rubble for stone for this? And they said, oh, hey, up on the hill up there, there's actually, you don't even need a quarry. There's a whole bunch of old, Roman ruins and stuff that are just sitting up on the hill. So the Germans go up on the hill, and they see all of this stuff, and they're like, are you serious? They knew what they had, and they realized that the Turks didn't really care and didn't know what they had. So what they did is they traded, we will build the road if we can have Zeus's temple. And they said, are you serious? That's a great deal. So they moved this. So this temple right now, obviously it doesn't look like it's on the hillside. This you can actually go to a museum in Berlin and see it. So it's no longer there. And the Turks say this is one of the greatest mistakes they ever did, was not respect what they had and give it away, because obviously the Germans aren't giving it back. But it's pretty amazing, all the marble figures and everything that they have on there.
Yes. So since then, the Turks have really learned to value what they have, and so they are very much invested in their archaeological sites. Izmir is a city that we stayed in, so this is strictly a tourist slide. On the left is the Mövenpick Hotel. That's where we stayed for 2 nights. I have no idea what Mövenpick means, but that's where we stayed. It was lovely. It was right on the Aegean Sea. So so you could walk out of our hotel across a very busy road, and there was like an open city center area, and then the ocean. It was beautiful. So we were walking out there, and then there were a strip of restaurants that ran along like a boardwalk area. And so we went down there and tried to order dinner, and it was just really funny because this was our first experience of like trying to order food in a different country where you're kind of just pointing at pictures and we'll see what we get. But the beautiful thing was we got a ton of seafood. There were 6 of us there, and I think we paid.
It was a fancy restaurant. It would have been, for us, $150 here, like in Chicago. I think we paid $150 at the most for the whole table for like amazing seafood. And it was like, we don't know what to get. And the Turkish guys who ran the place were amazing. They're like, you should get this, 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 and this. And they just brought everything out, and we feasted, and it was amazing. And it was
amazing. So in this picture, the 2 people on the far left and the far right, these are our professors. Dr. Lyons, Tom on the left, and then Becky, the cat lady, on the right. And these were the professors that were there with us. And then I served as a TA on the trip. I helped organize it. And then we had a professional guide that traveled with us. So we had one guide that was with us in Turkey. And then when we got to Greece, we had a different guide. And the guide that we had in Turkey has been doing this for 30 years. He was amazing. Like, if you ever go to Turkey, get Saba, because he told us when we needed to take bathroom breaks, when we needed to eat. Like, he just knew everything in advance, and he'd be like, this place has a good bathroom, we're gonna stop here. It's like, you're my hero, Saba, you're great. It was really nice to be in an organized trip. There were 32 of us. That's a lot of people to move through city centers and all that kind of good stuff. So we were grateful to have the team. And then Becky and Tom organized the teaching for us. And we had a lot of students that gave lectures in the different places as well.
The fascinating thing about Saba too is we were in an Islamic country that we thought it was going to be very Islamic, and it was interesting how it was kind of like the United States, how Christianity is here, Islam was there. There was temples mosques everywhere, just like we have churches everywhere, but it was culturally similar. People went. But Saba, the way he was talking about the Bible, the way he was teaching us about the things, we were like, wow, this is amazing. This Turkish guy is a Christian, and it's really cool that we got him. And figured out afterwards, we think he might be Muslim.
Yeah.
So the amount that he was teaching us about the Bible and the places, and finding out afterwards that he may have been Muslim was pretty cool.
Yeah.
But the main professor that didn't go with us, Scott McKnight, that goes on these trips forever with Saba, I think he's been kind of teaching him over the years. So praying for Saba, and over the time seeing how much he's learned and how much the Bible means to him. So it's fascinating.
So this is, when we walked out of our hotel in Izmir and crossed the busy road, this is what we saw. This is the Aegean right across the street from us. And both evenings we kind of went out and walked along that area. I'm not gonna lie, it was beautiful. it was amazing. So these are just my trip bragging photos, honestly. Okay, Sardis. So Sardis was another large ancient city that we went to. It's one of the 7 churches mentioned in Revelation. Couple things about Sardis. They were famous for producing white woolen garments. And so in the book of Revelation, when John is writing to them, he's mentioning that they need to be clothed. He's saying that they're naked and they need to put on these white garments. And then he also talks about their need to wake up. And there was a story about Sardis in the ancient world. It was a walled city, and one of the guards in a watchtower had fallen asleep several nights in a row, and the Persian army was coming and they had laid siege to the city, and Sardis was sure that the Persians were never going to be able to break the wall and get in. But because this guard fell asleep in the watchtower, the Persian army was able to invade. So when John tells them to wake up in this city, it meant something. So he's telling them that they need to pay attention and be ready for the presence of God. So this picture on the left is a series of shops. So this is very developed, and each of the shops, there were 27 of them, and they had different symbols within them to tell you if they were a Jewish or a Christian shop owner, which is kind of fascinating. So this, again, is much later in time. And then the picture on the right is a latrine. So there were a couple of photos of these that we took in a couple different places, but they all look the same. It's kind of a row of seats with a trench underneath it, and the trench would have running water. The Romans were really very ingenuitive that would run through, but I just like the idea that you're sitting there with your friends. I'm not really sure how that works, but there it is, ancient latrines.
We were informed that there would have been, they weren't co-ed probably, but there was a community sponge. That was kind of the joke of the trip. There was a community sponge, and that's, yep. So, running water, but that's not quite as good as we have. So, Sardis, so this was right next door. So we went down a road with the latrine that was there and the shops, and they excavated the one side, and you can see all these shops. On the other side, it wasn't excavated yet, but you knew they were under there, and then there was just a modern road. And at the end, you got to this synagogue. So Sardis, and this is like everything over there. Sardis at this time was from 4th century, okay? But we know from the Bible that they were there before. So all of this was built on top of it. And when we were over there, they kept saying, like, we wouldn't have anything if we were worried about building on top of something, because everywhere there are ruins. Ruins upon ruins upon ruins. Because this is 4th century, and below it is 1st century, and below that is pre-BC. So, not pre-BC, BC, right? So this synagogue was amazing. A lot of mosaics in the floor, and just different things on the wall, different marble and everything.
Yep, so it just shows the presence of large Jewish communities in Asia Minor.
So then this here is right next door to that. So you can kind of see on the side here, see the covered roof, a little piece of covered roof. So that's the synagogue. And then right next door, this is a Roman bath. And so this is the entryway. So it's kind of a gymnasium and a Roman bath. So behind that is the baths here. And there were 3 of them. They were very large. And they would have like a scalding hot, really warm, and cooler. So they would use this to hang out and get clean and be part of the gymnasium here. It was pretty amazing to see the Jewish stuff right next to the Roman stuff.
Yeah, super cool.
Yeah.
So again, Rome very concerned about hygiene. So we're going to go fast. So Philadelphia was one of the churches mentioned in Revelation. Again, this is a 6th century church, so not from the earliest parts, but it's, again, goes to show the history in the area. But
Just one of the 7 churches.
Yeah, we'll keep going because we got a lot. Hierapolis.
So Hierapolis, really cool place. So this was all water that was flowing from the mountainside, and it was all sodium bicarbonate. And if you're familiar with travertine stone, this is travertine. So this is what they mined. And I think it was something like 12,000 years. We got some geologists here. 12,000 years that this started flowing out. In recent time, it had slowed down a lot. Okay, so back then it would have been flowing more, especially 12,000 years ago, it would have been flowing a lot more. So it was cool to think that realistically, all of these structures, 2,000 years ago, they probably looked really, really similar to what we're seeing right now. Really cool place. So Hierapolis, and then I went up the hill. So this is up very high, and then you go up higher, and there was a big church up there to Philip, and a theater and everything. So this was another town. But the main thing from this is in Revelation, we'll talk about the 3 different places here. But if you'll recall when John says, that God said, you're either hot nor cold, but lukewarm or I'll spit you out. So this hot water from these springs would flow down the hillside, and you'll see 3 different cities. In the distance out there, you can see before the mountains, there's kind of some hills, and that's going to be the next place we go, which is another town. So there's 3 cities that are very close proximity to each other, and this would be the hot water that's flowing. So really close to that, we were in luxury. This was one of the hotels we were at. So on the right here, this is actually all outdoor hot springs. Hot spring fed, mineral, really, really fun, especially after a long couple days. We got to hang out here with everyone. Indoor pool was gorgeous, and then inside, it was a Turkish bath. So they had you could get massages. They had like a full Turkish bath that they would do. It was pouring water and everything. None of us did those things, but then they had inside different types of baths and heat and cold and saunas. So it was really cool to experience that whole Turkish bath environment in just an amazing hotel.
Okay, Colossae. So they warned us before we got here, and they said Colossae is a sign and a hill. So just so you know, when we get there, you know Colossians, the letter to the Colossians, what you're going to see is a hill. So that's exactly what it was. So, what's that? Sure. So it's a hill. They haven't excavated it yet. It's owned privately, but they do have a guardhouse out there to make sure you don't climb the hill. So that was their big concern. But like Jeff said, Hierapolis had the hot springs. Colossae is at the bottom of a mountain, and it has a spring-fed stream that runs next to it. So that's where you get the ice-cold water. So it's really interesting. And when you're standing on Hierapolis, I think you said this, you can see Colossae, and you can also see the other town, which is Laodicea. They kind of form a triangle. And you can, if you're standing in any one of them, you can see the other two, which is really fascinating.
Now the cool thing about Colossae here, Jason, who's standing there, all of the students were able to give little mini talks at each one of the places. And so Jason gave a talk on slavery here, which was amazing because, so we were at Colossae, which is where Philemon lived. So the letter to Philemon, which spelled out Onesimus, who was a slave who ran away, was with Paul, was a brother to Paul, was a Christian, and he said the right thing would be to go back. So he sent a letter to Philemon. We're all familiar with that. So this was the place. This was the city. And so in a further time, to cut it short, we were going to talk, but just pretty profound experience that I had here, just with that story and with the dogs that were there, and just this idea, and Jason speaking there of
just how there are certain things that are so huge that as a Christian, you feel like I can't change this entire system. And that's Paul when it comes to slavery. I can't take down the Roman Empire and change their minds about this institution that they have codified over generations. I can't do that, but I can send Onesimus back to Philemon and tell him he's a brother in Christ and have Onesimus be the one handing the letter to Philemon in the presence of his whole household, because Philemon ran a house church. So if you can imagine Philemon reading this letter in the presence of his household slaves, where Paul is urging him to accept this runaway slave as a brother in Christ. Paul's saying, I can't tackle the whole thing, but I can tell one person what he should be doing. So that's kind of the story of Colossae.
Sometime I had a whole thing planned, but it was going to take too long.
Yes.
So maybe do a little mini sermon on this because it's pretty profound.
Yes. Laodicea is the third of these three little cities that are super close together. This was one of my favorite places that we visited. It's a relatively new excavation. So you saw Colossae is just a hill because they haven't tackled it yet. They haven't started digging. Laodicea, they've been digging for maybe 20, 25 years. So this is relatively new. It was really fun to see. One of the things that was our tour guide, Saba, almost broke into tears telling us this story because he was so excited about it. This column on the left, you can see, has some symbols on it. It's probably hard to see from where you're sitting, but there are three Jewish symbols. It has a menorah, an olive branch, and a ram's horn. And then coming out of the menorah is a cross. And Saba said when they found this column, it was in a Roman fountain, and he said the column was facing the wall. So he said it's almost like somebody wanted to draw something that was symbolizing this transformation they had experienced, but didn't want it to be visible. And so he said when they started digging things out, they found this. And so he was just so excited to make sure that we saw it because he thinks it's really neat. So that was really fun to see. The middle picture is a picture of a Roman road, and you can just see the pavement there. This is part of what allowed Paul to travel between cities and to preach the gospel. The other thing that I personally love to point out is there was a house church in Laodicea that we know of that was hosted by a woman named Nympha. It is one of the few house churches that we know of that was led by a woman, and this was in Laodicea. So that's my little plug for that. Also in Laodicea, this again I got so excited about, one of the first known church buildings that was built as a church. So in a lot of Asia Minor and a lot of first century Christianity, what you're looking at are house churches because it was still an illegal religion. This building was built after the Edict of Milan, sometime after 313 AD when Constantine was the emperor. So several generations later. But it was one of the first buildings that was built as a church. Laodicea was a very wealthy area. This church building was huge, but I studied art history in college and I studied a lot of church architecture, so I was nerding out, being so excited to see what an early church included in their architecture. The right-hand picture is of a baptistry. So this gets me so excited. It's on the east front side of the church, so baptisms always face east in the ancient world, and it's in the shape of a cross. So, you're thinking the early 300s, when they built a church, this is what they built. So this has only been excavated, I think they were saying the last 10 or 15 years, and it had a lot, again, of mosaics on the floor, a lot of detail. It was really beautiful.
This was definitely one of the highlights for the whole trip, though. It was amazing to see. Okay, so the other highlight, Ephesus, was just huge, and it put everything into perspective. So up until then, we were having our minds blown, and Sal was just like, oh, just wait, Now, Laodicea was his favorite, and one of ours, because it was 20 years excavated. So he said since he's been doing this, it was like Colossae, where it was a hill, just a dirt hill. So everything you saw in Laodicea is only 20 years removed. So all those mounds and everything just have endless amounts of things underneath them still. They knew the church was there from history. They kind of were like, there is a church here, we kind of know about it, but we haven't uncovered it. So Ephesus has been, is still very much being excavated, but it's been a long time excavated. So it was the fourth largest city with 250,000 people in Ephesus. You can see here, we actually started at the top. Our bus came to the top, which usually common folk like us would have never really gone to the top, or very rarely. So we actually started at the top with where all the rich people were. And you see this smaller theater here, which would have been where where civic things happened. All the important people would sit around and discuss things. And then this is a street here on the other side with all the shops, and down a little ways is where the terrace houses are, which we're going to see in a second here. But the main thing about Ephesus, and Laura's going to talk about this, was Artemis worship was huge here. It was it here. They had a festival every year they would come to, and if you remember, they almost had a riot in Acts. This was mind-blowing. We started being in places that were in Scripture. So in this little theater here is where Paul is standing, and all the silversmiths are there, and all the people are there, and they're really, really irritated with these Christians, specifically Paul, because he's teaching that you're supposed to worship the living God, not gods that were made of silver. Okay? Specifically then, actually how it worked, Artemis worship. So all the people would buy for a lot of money these little gods, and then bring them to the Artemis temple or the other temples in this culture in general as like giving favors to the gods so that they would give favors back to them, and that's how the system worked. And then the silversmiths would go and take them that they just donated over here, and they would bring them back to the shop, and they would resell them or melt them down. So there was a lot of money in here. And there was a riot that broke out. They started chanting, "Greatest Artemis of the Ephesians," if you remember that passage. And then just right over here was where the office of
The city clerk
was. And it's cool because Saba is telling us, like, here's the theater, and right here is where, all the judges had their offices and everything. So the city clerk would have been right here, and he can hear all this happening, and he runs out and he puts a stop to it and says, "There's really nothing founded on here. We're going to get charged with rioting," and kind of put a stop to it. But it didn't get Paul off the hook. So if you remember, Paul left Timothy behind in Ephesus, but Paul had to leave because he was hurting the economy there. So for his life, he kind of had to flee and left Timothy behind.
The other thing on this slide, on the left-hand side, are these water pipes. And we asked Saba, like, are those props? Like, what's with those pipes? And he said, no. He said they're just scattered all over the place. They're constantly digging them up, so they just pile them up in a big pile. Those are ancient Roman water pipes. And he said that's how they made them, out of clay. And they're in little sections, so if one broke, you just pop it out and put in a new one. But they're like, you could see them literally all over the place. And it was just kind of.
It wasn't like a thing that they could do. It's a thing that there was flowing water pipes through the entire city. Yep. It was pretty amazing for that time period. That how we think of them being primitive human beings, it was fascinating.
So also, when you're in Ephesus, you're coming down the hill, there are these terrace houses. Now you're still sort of in the elite section. These houses, they don't know if they were like an individual family household or if they were apartment buildings because they were so huge. So you walked into them, they were multi-stories. They were about 4 stories. They think that the first story was sort of the business level. And then you would go up a level, and that's like the living area. And then the rooms, like the bedrooms, were up another level. But they had running water in these. They had fountains in them. They had extensive mosaics and frescoes. This is definitely the houses of the wealthy. But what we thought was so interesting is that Paul made it a habit as he was traveling throughout the Roman Empire, as people were becoming Christians. If they lived in a large house like this, guess what they became? Hosts of house churches. So house churches probably would have been 20 to 30 people gathered in a room. These terrace houses have rooms big enough to host that kind of group. And the fountains that they had would sometimes serve as baptismals. So it's just fascinating to see what that looked like. We've got a couple pictures, but it's really hard to do justice in the pictures to what these look like. I mean, walking through them was pretty amazing. So you get a sense of just the lavishness with the mosaics on the floor. The picture on the left, this is called a basilica room, and all of these terrace houses have one. And they kept telling us, we're not really sure what the different functions are, but the basilica is probably sort of the business space or one of those business spaces. So if you think about, like, you've got your family, your slaves, your household, maybe a couple generations, you have your business space on the early levels where the public can come in and do trade. It's just kind of fascinating. But they kept telling us, these are our best guesses. We're not entirely sure how they used these spaces, but we do know that Priscilla and Aquila lived in Ephesus, and that there's some speculation that they were of the wealthy ruling class. They may have lived in one of these and hosted a house church. So it's just kind of fun to imagine, but we're not entirely sure. But these houses were just really spectacular.
So just a couple more pictures here of Ephesus. So this was the huge theater here. We didn't have that. Do you remember how many people?
I don't remember.
Just absolutely massive theater. So the one that I showed you before, where you saw the little people, this was maybe twice again. And the cool thing about this is they have modern concerts and everything in here, fundraiser concerts. How cool would that be to go to one in Ephesus and watch a concert? And then this over here was another of the largest libraries. You know, the top four we already talked about. In Laodicea had the second largest one. In Pergamum was the second largest one. And just absolutely amazing, this large library that was also in Ephesus here.
All right, so now I'm going to just do a little chunk of teaching, because I think that for me, one of my takeaways is trying to fully wrap my brain around the role that Artemis played in Ephesian culture. So I printed out for you the words to 1 Timothy chapter 2. I think this is 8 through 15, if I remember off the top of my head. But I'm going to walk us through it, and because there were a couple things that came together as we were traveling. The first is Becky, the professor who loves cats, was reading to us on the bus as we traveled between cities a book called The Ephesiaka. And The Ephesiaka is a novel written in the 1st century, around 50 AD, that tells a story of, it's almost like a Romeo-Juliet story, but it's two young lovers from the city of Ephesus, and then it goes on and it kind of reads like The Princess Bride, if you've watched that movie. So there's pirates, there's fire, there's pits, there's poison. I mean, it's just a fascinating story, but it begins in the city of Ephesus with this young man and this young woman, and they are part of the Artemis festival procession in the 1st chapter. And so the language from that, if it was written at 50 AD, Paul was in the city of Ephesus between 51 and 52 AD. So this is the same time frame. Okay, so the Ephesiaka is describing this young woman with her braided hair, her elaborate hairstyle, her elaborate, lavish clothing, and processing through the city of Ephesus with all of these virgin young maidens. And the Artemis Festival every spring was basically a giant matchmaking event where all the girls would travel in one direction, all the guys would travel in another direction, and they're kind of checking each other out. So you kind of have this image in your head. And the Artemis cult in Ephesus was, when girls were growing up in the city, they had a role to play in the religious traditions of Artemis. So they were expected to promote the religious worship of Artemis through their dress, through their hairstyle, and through their teaching. So that's the backdrop for this. So I'm going to read this passage, and I've highlighted a couple things. I am going to tell you what scholars have discovered about the Artemis cult and how it lines up with Paul's letter here. The other piece I want to make very clear is this is not a public letter. 1 Timothy is a letter to an individual, to Paul's protege, young pastor Timothy. who is serving in Ephesus. So Paul has moved on to another part of the Roman world. He's writing a letter to Pastor Timothy about how to pastor people in Ephesus, where the Artemis cult is the major religious backdrop. Okay, so keep all that in mind. Here we go. Therefore, I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. I also want the women to dress modestly with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles or gold or pearls or expensive clothes, but with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship God. A woman should learn in quietness and full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. So Paul is writing this to Timothy about how to pastor people, specifically men and women, in the city of Ephesus. Okay, so the elaborate hairstyles. In the Artemis cult, your hairstyle would demonstrate the amount of wealth that you had. I mean, this was largely true in the Roman Empire. The more elaborate your hairstyle, the more time you had to sit in the beauty chair while your slaves attended you. That's just the reality. So this is a way of pointing out your material wealth to anyone else you would encounter. Okay, expensive clothes. Your expensive clothes were an honor to the goddess. In fact, there's evidence that the Artemis statue in the temple of Artemis was regularly outfitted with different outfits and jewelry to decorate her for worship. This was part of how they worshipped Artemis. So the women in the community would do something similar, would follow that style. Okay? And Paul is saying this is not appropriate for Christian worship. First of all, the Roman wife who has the money to spend hours sitting in the chair getting her hair styled by her slaves may be sitting in worship next to a slave responsible for hairstyles. So when she comes to worship, she should wear her hair simply. She should do it herself. She should not wear elaborate clothing because when you're in worship, it's not the time to point out your social differences. Does that make sense? So this is what Paul is saying to Timothy. Outside of the church, all of this is socially acceptable behavior. Paul is saying in the church it ought to look different. Okay, learning in silence and submission. Young Ephesian women were trained very early to pray and to perform worship rituals in Artemis' temple. This is their community task, if this makes sense. Like, this is what young girls were tasked with doing to show their civic pride. They were to teach, they were to pray, they were to perform religious rituals. So when they became Christians, they had to go through a transformation, where before they would have had a role, now they needed to learn about Jesus. And Paul, in the Greek here, is using the present tense. He's saying, I am not permitting, I am not currently allowing women in these roles. It's very important. Okay, so the other piece is, again, Ephesian women were to participate in this process because it was a major moneymaker for the city of Ephesus. Thousands of pilgrims arrived in Ephesus for this spring festival every year. They're pumping money into the city of Ephesus. So again, major civic role for these young women. The other piece is this idea of assuming authority. I don't know if you know this or not, but the Greek word there is authentein, and it has to do with usurping authority, taking authority that is not yours. Remember, in Ephesus, these women had religious authority, and now Paul is asking them to set it aside until they learned the truths of Christianity. They needed to set aside a common cultural role that they already expected to have and to put on something new. Adam formed first. Okay. In the Artemis story, she's a god that is born full grown, and she's a twin. So when she was born born first, and she helped her mother deliver her twin brother. But her mother had a hard time. It took her 9 days in labor to deliver her brother. This was the origin story of Artemis. So Artemis, after this experience of watching her mother go through all of this, decided she was going to be a perpetual virgin. She was not going to go through this. So what you need to know about the Ephesian Artemis cult is that it was a virgin goddess that these people worshipped. So she celebrated values of virginity, chastity, and fidelity. And this comes out in this Ephesian tale, the Ephesiaka, these two young lovers that get married, then are split by pirates, and they go through all these things, and they end up in all these different places. They're separate from one another, but they're both determined to remain faithful to one another. It's a major feature of the story, and it's because of their devotion to Artemis. So hopefully you're tracking with me. So when Paul is writing to Timothy, he's counteracting the Artemis origin story, because he's saying in Christianity, Adam was formed first, not Artemis. And he's saying the man was deceived, or the woman was deceived first, because in the Artemis story, it's the man who was deceived first. So he's making the point, this story, let's not be confused, they're different. And then finally, salvation through childbearing. So in the ancient world, childbearing was very, very dangerous. And so in Ephesus, Artemis was the patron saint of childbearing, because she went through this experience with her own mother, and there were two ways that Artemis could save you in childbearing. Either she would help you have a safe delivery, or if it was taking too long and you were in danger, she would kill you. And this is how they taught it. So this is how Artemis was your savior, and they referred to her as the savior. She saves you by helping you produce a child safely, or by killing you so that you don't linger for 9 days in pain. Okay, so when Paul is saying women will be saved through childbearing, he's saying Jesus cares about pregnant women too, and these young women in Ephesus might be tempted to pray to Artemis because they're terrified about giving birth. And he's saying God also offers protection. Keep in mind, Paul is writing to a pastor, not to a community. He's talking to a pastor about how to pastor people who have grown up with a very different religious background. Okay, that's a lot of territory, and if you have questions, we can talk about it. But I want to show you, on the left is a model in the Ephesus Museum of the Temple of Artemis. So you need to know in Ephesus, every structure was covered with white marble, and it was a port city. So when you came in under the hot Mediterranean sun, the city glowed. Everything was lit up because of this white marble. So the Artemis Temple was one of the largest temples in the ancient world, and it was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It's no longer there, there's just one pillar. So, like, if you go to the site, it's just a pillar. But in the museum, they have a model of it. And then on the right is a statue of Artemis, so you can get an idea of what she looks like with her elaborate hairstyle and her dress and her jewels. Okay.
So the thing about this that was such an impact to me, being here in this place, when we were in Ephesus, 250,000 people, and we went, because it's in Turkey now, they're Islamic, they're not Christians, in this huge ancient Roman city. There was nothing about Christianity. Just like when it existed, there was nothing about Christianity. All 250,000 people were worshiping Artemis together as a community. And this building was down by the bay, down by the bay, I guess, port, where all these ships would come in, and it was gleaming, and you could see it from a distance, which for me was just profound, because this passage in particular, we're like, oh, that's kind of a stretch, this Artemis thing, I see that and everything, and then you go there and you're like, oh, it's not a stretch. There wasn't this big Christian influence. There was this huge Artemis influence. So when Paul is there and Timothy is there, it is absolutely saturated with this mindset. Whereas now we're like, oh, that's kind of foreign. That really doesn't make sense. But it made perfect sense to them.
Totally. All right. this is just a picture of all the students from Northern on the trip that were gathered together. This is the theater in Ephesus. So it was students and spouses. These are just the students. Give you a sense, it's just a fun shot of my friends in Ephesus on the steps.
They just didn't want me in the picture. All right, so that was Turkey. All of that. And then we got to stay at this amazing city here. We actually stayed at this hotel right on the Aegean Sea. This pool, zero edge pool, I forget what those things are called. Infinity pool, the edge. Got to swim in the Aegean Sea. And then Jason, who was teaching at Colossae about slaves, jumped in the Aegean Sea and landed on a sea urchin and had to get, they stopped counting at 10 spines removed from his foot. So luckily after a couple days he was better, but we felt horrible for him. So we got to stay in this hotel, which was beautiful on the Aegean for a couple days, for 2 days while we were visiting these sites around. And then we boarded a cruise ship, and then we went out into the Greek islands to make our trip over. The first stop was Patmos. Now here's where my modern type Christianity and ancient Christianity collided. Because we got to see all of these amazing places in a place that wasn't Christian, that was kind of untouched. So we're seeing all these ruins, in Roman places, this early church. So then we got to go to Patmos, to the cave where John wrote Revelation. And it was saturated with Christianity. It was Greek Orthodox, and the cave was kind of still there, but there was a whole bunch of shrines everywhere. There was a whole bunch of icons. I always lose that word. Icons everywhere. It was honestly kind of hard for me to be there. And it was about money. They were like rushing you through. There was a lot of tourists. We had the other places to ourselves. I mean, Ephesus was fairly busy, but it was huge. And this was just quickly just going through Patmos. And you got to go in the cave. They wouldn't let you take pictures. You could buy a picture. You could buy an icon. They had a museum there with absolutely priceless artifacts, priceless icons, with open windows and sunlight coming in. So like we were with an archaeologist and the whole time he's like, what is going on? You know? So it was kind of hard to see that. But it was cool to see this cave where John wrote Revelation. But it was an interesting experience having that.
So then we went to Santorini, which has no biblical value at all. It's just really pretty. When we pulled up in the cruise ship, you can see on the left-hand side the white that kind of looks like snow on top of the mountaintop. Those are the houses and the churches that are on, and it's really like there was a terrifying bus ride up the mountainside to get to this area. But it's lovely. It was very picturesque. You can see the houses.
Can you see the lines right here serpentining? That's where our large bus.
Coach bus.
Went.
It was terrifying. But it was all to get to see all these beautiful things, us and like 5,000 of our friends, tourist friends. So this picture I did strictly because it cracks me up. So this, on Instagram how they have like the reality versus, the Instagram picture. So this is what the crowds were like on the left, and you were packed in like sardines to these teeny tiny narrow streets, and everybody is just trying to get to like 3 or 4 different photo sites. And you stand in line forever in the heat, and then you get your 2 pictures, and then it was nuts. I was not a fan, but we did get some lovely pictures.
There was this beautiful lady I was following around the whole island.
And then they do have some really lovely churches. And I put the middle, I don't know if you can read the middle sign, but it says, "This is a holy place. Please don't climb on the church. Thank you." So that just gives you like mobs of people crowded around taking pictures of all these lovely places. So Corinth in Greece we went to, and remember I showed you on the map that it's in this tiny little strip of land between 2 ports. So one port on, I think it's the east side, is Kenkrea. On the west side is Lechaeum. I'm probably just butchering that pronunciation, but they're on two different seas, and it's a strip of land. Corinth made its money because you would have to dock at one port, unload all of your cargo, carry it across land, reload it on the other side of the other port in order to keep going to travel west. So they made their money by taxing people unloading cargo and moving it through the city and then reloading it. Eventually they did put in a canal, but it was a very long process. I don't think they finished till the 1800s. So that was how Corinth made their money. Paul visited there and spent time there. He was there for 1.5 years with Priscilla and Aquila. Paul got accused of inciting the Jews in Corinth, and there was a council that was held there. The picture on the right is the bema. Paul would have stood at that post there. The judges would have stood up on top of that little platform there to evaluate, and Proconsul Gallio basically said, this is a dispute among the Jews. We don't know whether we're not worried about it, but it was a moment that was kind of exciting in Paul's life.
So this was along with just a couple different places that, we were speculating, the house church, the terrace houses, they could have met in here, they could have met next door. And then there's a couple of these, including where I talked about the theater, where they were yelling about Artemis, and this other one of just, we know that Paul stood in that post that's there, they found there. That's the post, and there's history that this is how it happened. So Paul stood at that post, and the leaders stood up top there. We know that happened here. So that there's a couple of those things that were just like, Paul stood here.
Yeah.
And this happened from the Bible right where we're standing, which was pretty amazing.
Then we made sort of an unscheduled stop in Kenkrea, because you can see it's basically a public beach, and we went there because there are some ruins there of first century church. Kenkrea is one of the ports that borders Corinth, and this is where Phoebe came from. Phoebe was a deacon in Kenkrea, and then Paul gave her the letter to the Romans and sent her she was a businesswoman. She went to Rome and visited the house churches and presented the book of Romans to the Roman churches. And you should know that presenting a book or a letter from Paul meant she taught it. So she was tasked with the responsibility of visiting all the churches in Rome and sharing with them the letter from Paul, and then answering questions that they had and helping them understand what Paul meant by that letter. So this is where she's from. And to celebrate that, one of our professors asked that we have an all-female-led communion service at Kenkrea. So I presided over communion there for our little group, and the two women that assisted me, one held the bread, one held the wine, are two women that are northern students that had never been allowed to serve communion before, had never been allowed to hold the elements. So this was a really powerful moment for us to gather and to practice this together. So that's what we're doing in that picture, next to the beachfront with all of the swimmers. So that was kind of fun.
That was pretty amazing to be there with them through that. It was pretty amazing for the whole class.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Sure. There's a lot of this trip that was profound for me, being with her for so long, and just seeing all of this scripture and come to life, and being with just other women in her class that were seeing this and learning and getting to learn from them, and just seeing how being there and reading scripture from there in that context just made a lot more sense than the context that I've lived in and have been taught that really was irrelevant to the Romans and to Artemis worship at the time. So being there with those ladies, getting to do that was pretty amazing for the whole class, for everyone's spouses, because a lot of the spouses were guys with their wives who were in school, so that was pretty cool. So this is where I got to geek out. So we went to Athens then, and the Parthenon. We just have this thought of the ancients that they were primitive. Going there and seeing the seat of mathematics and science. So the Parthenon, it was explained that it was easy for them to make perfect. Okay? So not only was the Parthenon made perfect, what it was every single one of those columns in there was made wrong on purpose. Because if you see a column from a distance that's straight up and down, it looks curved. It's the way that the human eye works. So every single one of these columns were mathematically made to counteract what the eye did. And when you looked at this bottom right here, if you looked at it from a distance, it was absolutely perfectly flat. And when you got up close to it, you could see an arch in it. Every single column, every single thing was made exactly like that, so that when you were at a distance, it looked perfect. Just absolutely amazing. So we're there as the Romans were they didn't have calculators, they didn't have these things, they were just brilliant minds. So we're there during that. This here was another temple to the founder of the city. And it was like more imperial worship, where you're worshiping the emperor and worshiping the people of the city, not necessarily deities, but a lot of times they kind of were treated as deities or kind of proclaimed deityism. Is that right? For themselves. So the Parthenon and the other one is right up there, the Acropolis that you can see in the distance there. And where we're standing is another, so there's three very large kind of hills within Athens. The tallest one is where the Parthenon was. This one here is Mars Hill. So what was told to us there by our guide was, before, during this Roman time, murder was treated as a sin against a family. Okay? So if someone killed Laura, I could go after them civilly, and I could demand justice. If I'm alone and I don't have a family, and somebody kills me, there's really nobody there to take that up. Okay, so you were both having vigilante justice that was generation after generation, or you had people just killing people because they didn't have families and it was no big deal. And the Romans were like, we're civilized, this isn't okay. So they started doing trials for murder. So, unfortunately, there wasn't that many. So they would use this top for those trials, but most of the time so they built it for that, and it was all marble. You can see the old foundations that were there, none of the marble was left. But what they used it for most of the time was philosophical conversations, okay? And I forgot to look it up, but there were 6-minute dissertations that they had, and they had to be professionally done, and they practiced, and in that 6-minute time, they would have your intro, and they would sell you on an idea, and they would wrap it up in a package, and by the end, that 6 minutes, they had to convince you of their thing. So you couldn't ramble on for an hour like, Laura and I have been doing here. You had 6 minutes to do it, okay? So this is where Paul was standing and having one of these conversations, and anything went. These were philosophers. You could stand up there and you can talk about whatever, and anything went. In 6 minutes. So he's up there, and this is where we see Paul's dissertation, where he talks to them about, I see that you are religious people. You even have this unknown God up here. Let me tell you about him. So we're standing in that spot, and I'm kind of pointing here, pretending like I'm Paul, and you can just see in the distance, he goes, you have this unknown God, and they're pointing up to the Parthenon, and they talked about potentially this other thing that was gone now to the god of Cosmos, which they think was who he was talking about, which was the god of all order. So I was totally geeking out. All the seminary students were like, okay, this is boring. And I'm the Parthenon and this this God that had a mathematical order that held everything together, that was above all the other gods, and all things fit together mathematically with purpose, that the whole world had order. And I'm like, that sounds like our God. And that's the God that those ideas they worshipped, and Paul is pointing to that. So it wasn't just randomly like, oh, you're religious, there's this other God. That God stood for so much that they didn't understand that our God answered, which was pretty cool.
So that's it, everybody. You made it through 11 days of Turkey and Greece, all the different places that we went to. I think, again, I just want to say, like, our biggest takeaway from this is there's something really powerful about getting a sense of the context for the New Testament. And that involves understanding details about the Roman Empire and the gods they worshipped and the way that they functioned in community, what their structures look like, what their cities look like. Also understanding first century Judaism and where it fit into the context of this, and the fact that there were Jewish centers in Asia Minor for Paul to go visit and bring the gospel. And then also just understanding the geography was really powerful, and beginning to understand, like, oh, these are mountains that Paul would have had to climb to get from point A to point B. And this is the ocean that he traveled on. These are the islands where he would encounter while he's traveling between different locations. So it's just fascinating to be able to visualize what those places look like. And that's why Scott McKnight basically insists that all of his New Testament students go on this trip, because he feels like if you're going to teach it, you should see it. So, yeah, it was technically a class that we all had to take, but it was a really fun class.
And I wish that before we went, someone did this for us, because it was really confusing. And then you get halfway through the trip and you're like, oh, this is how all that fits together. Because we weren't quite, I didn't know about Philadelphia, some of these obscure, Rome, the seven churches. I wasn't expecting that. And then halfway through the trip, it's like, okay, can we start over again? I went on to seminary, so. But now, pretty cool how it all fits together.
Yeah. Well, thank you all. So I guess we're over time, so I want to be respectful. But if you've got any questions, a couple questions, we'd love to take a shot at them. I know a couple of you have been to some of these places, so if you want to offer anything as well, love to hear it.
So the one thing now that was very interesting to me, so I told a couple stories here, like the murder charges and everything. There was a couple fascinating stories that we heard from guides and the seminary students after. I was like, wow, that was amazing. And they're like, yeah, that's like one of the possibilities, but that's down here and there's four above. So it was humbling in that, like, don't believe everything you hear, because there are like four different things. Which was pretty interesting to hear. And then other ones were like, no, we're pretty sure. They're like, pretty sure that's factual. There's a whole lot of evidence for that. And then other ones were, speculation of things.
Yeah.
In those excavated areas where we could see the tiles and everything, could you walk in there or not?
So it depended on the location. So in a lot of places, once they exposed the mosaics and the frescoes, they almost always had a roof over it to protect it from the elements. And in a lot of places, they even had glass over it. It just sort of depended. But there were places, I think, in Sardis where you could still walk over, like, the mosaics. Yeah. So it just depended on kind of where you were.
Most of the really nice, like the earliest church that we went to, the whole thing was absolutely stunning. I have pictures if you want to see them. But they had glass that was elevated about here above the floor, so you could walk through most of it and just look down, and then they would have a railing so you could see it not through glass, like right over the edge, and you could walk, not walk on it. And then in Ephesus, they would have, it was surprising because some of it was open, but when we were going through the terrace houses, you were all walking on protected things and looking down at the.
Of course, if they lasted this long, what would you guys do to them?
Yeah.
But they were all under dirt though. So that's the cool thing, is they're preserved under dirt. So like with Colossae, how that mound is still there, the government's like, it's there. Nobody's gonna steal, like, it's safe there. So when we get to it, when we raise the money, and I was talking to the archaeologist that was with us, it was awesome to have this archaeologist who lives in Indiana with us. We're all picking his brain the whole time. You have to have a master's degree in order to brush. Like you can't, because you can do so much damage. They're like, there's no hurry. We'll just leave it under the ground until a qualified person can do it correctly. So, yeah.
Masters in divinity?
I don't think so. I don't know that I qualify. I can like hold the brushes for the people who use the brushes.
I told him though that if I had gone to this trip when I was in elementary school as opposed to a fire station trip, I think I might have been an archaeologist. It was like a 50-50.
Well, great. I want to pray for us, and then if you guys want to hang around, there's a lot of detail that just in the interest of time we kind of breezed past, but we could talk about this forever. So let me pray for us. And just thank you all for coming. This is really fun. Jesus, I thank you that you transcend cultures and places, but that you take those into account as well. Thank you for the reminder that you love people, and that you love people in physical places who have relationships and context, and that you take all of that into account when you introduce your love to people. Thank you for the opportunity to share these stories and to see evidence of your love and your hand in spreading the good news of your death and resurrection to peoples around the world. Thank you for the reminder that you take people from very different contexts and form them together into one family, and the way that you have invited them to lay down evidence of their status and position in order to serve one another as we follow the kind of self-giving love that you've demonstrated for us on the cross. We thank you for that, Jesus, and thank you for the reminder just by looking at these pictures of the evidence of that. In your name I pray.